The smell of burning aviation fuel hit the village of Ellingen before the sound did. It was the 14th of March, 1944, and Staff Sergeant Harold Koshy was already on the ground, his parachute tangled in a bare elm tree at the edge of a frozen field, his left arm hanging wrong, his oxygen mask still strapped across his face. He had been in the air 11 seconds after the bailout order. He had been on German soil for less than 4 minutes when the first man reached him. The man wore a long leather coat. He was not a soldier. He carried no rifle. He showed no military identification. He walked across the field from the direction of the road with the unhurried pace of someone who had done this before or had been waiting for the chance to do it for a very long time. Koshy could not free himself from the harness. He could see the man's breath in the cold air and the dark shape of something in his right hand and the emblem on his lapel that Koshy had been briefed on in a room in England that now felt like it existed on another planet entirely. What happened in the next 90 seconds in that field outside Ellingen was witnessed by 3 German civilians who later gave depositions to American investigators. Their accounts agreed on every material detail. They disagreed only on whether the man in the leather coat said anything before he raised his arm. One witness said he spoke a single word. The other 2 said there was no word, just the sound of the field, and then a different sound, and then nothing. Koshy was 22 years old. He was from Pittsburgh. He had completed 17 missions. What happened to the man in the leather coat is the reason this story exists. Part 1. The order that made murder legal. By the winter of 1943, the strategic bombing campaign against Germany had become something the Nazi leadership had not anticipated and could not adequately counter. The 8th Air Force was flying B-17 formations over German cities. The RAF was burning Hamburg at night. The civilian population was dying in numbers that German civil defense planners had never modeled. Entire city blocks were being erased. The Gestapo, the SS, and the Nazi Party leadership understood that they had a morale problem. German civilians were watching Allied airmen bail out of damaged aircraft, float down into their neighborhoods, and then be taken prisoner, fed, processed, sent to camps where the International Red Cross had access. The men who had just killed their neighbors were being protected. That was the message the average German citizen was receiving, and the Nazi leadership decided it was the wrong message. On the 24th of May 1943, Reich Security Main Office Chief Ernst Kaltenbrunner circulated what became known internally as the Terrorfliegerlass, the Terror Flyer Decree. It was not a single document. It was a series of directives, memoranda, and orders that accumulated between 1943 and 1944, each one pushing further in the same direction. The core logic was simple. Allied airmen who bombed German civilians were not soldiers, they were terrorists, and terrorists did not have rights under the laws of war. Stop and think about what that meant. It meant that any German civilian, any party official, any policeman, any Gestapo officer could kill a downed Allied airman and face no legal consequence under German law. It meant that Luftwaffe fighter pilots who might have intervened to protect prisoners were given explicit orders not to. It meant that the entire infrastructure of German civil authority, mayors, district leaders, police commanders, was being handed a license to kill men in parachutes. The order was never published in newspapers. It was distributed through party channels, through Gestapo networks, through regional leadership conferences, but it spread. In the winter and spring of 1944, reports began reaching Allied intelligence of airmen being beaten to death by civilian crowds, shot on the ground by police, executed by Gestapo officers before any formal process could begin. Reread that line, executed before any formal process could begin, because there was no formal process. The decree was the process. Goebbels himself had contributed to the political logic of the Terrorfliegerlass. In a diary entry from May of 1943, he wrote that the German people had a right to defend themselves against enemy airmen by any means necessary. He was careful not to put this in a signed directive. He understood what he was doing. He was seeding the idea without leaving fingerprints. The actual legal architecture was built by someone else, a man named Heinrich Müller, known within the Gestapo as Gestapo Müller. To distinguish him from the dozens of other Müllers in the apparatus, was the operational chief who turned the ideological position into administrative reality. Born in 1900 in Munich, a former Bavarian policeman who had joined the NSDAP late and had been considered a suspect loyalist by some in the early SS, Müller had compensated for his late conversion with bureaucratic ferocity. He ran the Gestapo from 1939 until the end of the war. He was never captured. He is the highest-ranking Nazi official whose post-war fate remains officially unknown to this day. Müller's contribution to the Terrorfliegererlass was procedural. He drafted the chain of notification, the reporting requirements, the jurisdictional assignments. When a downed airman was killed by a civilian crowd or a local official, Müller's system determined who had to be notified, who had to file a report, and crucially, who did not have to be notified. The Wehrmacht was often explicitly excluded from the notification chain. This was deliberate. It prevented German military officers, some of whom had genuine professional objections to killing prisoners, from interfering. By the spring of 1944, the system was running. Allied intelligence had enough incident reports to understand what was happening, but not enough to build individual cases. The airmen were dying. The killers were protected by German law and German bureaucracy. The Allies were aware. Eisenhower's headquarters issued formal warnings to the German government through neutral channels in the autumn of 1944, stating explicitly that the murder of Allied airmen would be treated as a war crime subject to post-war prosecution. The German government acknowledged receipt of these warnings and continued the policy. Hold that detail. They acknowledged receipt. They knew. They continued. By the time the German surrender came on the 8th of May 1945, Allied investigators estimated that somewhere between 300 and 500 Allied airmen had been killed under the Terrorfliegererlass, or in circumstances directly traceable to its logic, beaten by crowds, shot by police, executed by Gestapo officers, killed by civilians who believed they were acting legally under party directives. The number 350 is the figure that appeared most consistently in the early JAG Corps investigations. 350 men who had survived their aircraft being destroyed, survived their parachute descent, and were then killed on the ground. Part 2. The man who decided to do something about it. George Smith Patton Jr. was 59 years old in May of 1945. He had been born in San Gabriel, California on the 11th of November 1885 into a family with a military tradition that predated the Civil War. He had graduated from West Point in 1909, competed in the modern pentathlon at the 1912 Stockholm Olympics, finishing 5th, and had been among the first American officers to command tanks in combat during the First World War. He had been shot in the left leg at the Battle of Chepi in 1918 and had directed his tanks from a shell crater while bleeding. He had also slapped 2 soldiers during the Sicily campaign in August of 1943. Both men were hospitalized for what Patton considered insufficient reasons. He had called one of them a coward to his face. The incident had nearly ended his career. Eisenhower had formally reprimanded him. He had been passed over for command of the Normandy invasion. By May of 1945, he commanded the Third Army, which had advanced further and faster than any comparable formation in the Western Theatre. His army had liberated more territory and taken more prisoners than any other American force in the European campaign. He was, by any measurable standard, the most effective operational commander the United States had fielded in the war. He was also, by documented record, genuinely furious about the Terrorfliegererlass. This is where the historical record requires care. Patton's fury about many things is well documented. He was furious frequently and publicly. But the specific anger he directed at the Terrorfliegererlass killings was different in character from his general operational impatience. His diary entries from late April and early May of 1945 contain multiple references to the murder of Allied airmen. He called the perpetrators murderous bastards in a diary entry dated the 28th of April 1945, a phrase that appears in Martin Blumenson's edited collection of Patton's papers published in 1974. Now meet the man who put the specific case in front of Patton, Colonel Charles B. Odom, 41 years old, from Shreveport, Louisiana, a lawyer in civilian life, a graduate of Louisiana State University Law School, class of 1927. He had joined the Army Reserve in the 1930s and been called to active duty in 1941. By the spring of 1945, he was serving as a senior JAG officer, Judge Advocate General's Corps, attached to 3rd Army Headquarters. His job was the legal architecture of military governance in the territories Patton's army had just overrun. Odom had been building files on Terrorfliegererlass cases since January of 1945, as 3rd Army advanced into Germany. He had investigators working across the newly captured territories, interviewing witnesses, collecting documents, identifying perpetrators. By the first week of May, he had complete or near-complete cases on 11 individuals who had participated in the killing of downed Allied airmen, under the authority of the Terrorfliegererlass. He brought these cases to Patton in the second week of May 1945. The war in Europe had been over for less than a week. The meeting between Odom and Patton is not documented in transcription. We do not have a verbatim account of what was said. What we have is what came out of it: a direct order from Patton to proceed with military tribunals immediately, without waiting for the broader war crimes apparatus that the Allied powers were still constructing at the highest levels. Patton did not want to wait for Nuremberg. He wanted these cases tried in his army's jurisdiction, under existing military law, now. Here is the key detail. The legal basis Odom had identified was not the emerging international war crimes framework. It was the existing laws and customs of war, codified in the Hague Conventions of 1907, which the United States had ratified and which the German government had also ratified. Under those conventions, the killing of a prisoner of war or a combatant who had surrendered was a war crime. The Terrorfliegererlass did not change that. German domestic law did not supersede international treaty obligations. The defense that perpetrators would try to mount, that they were acting under lawful orders, was exactly the defense that Odom's legal team was prepared to demolish. Think about what this means. The perpetrators believed they were protected. They had a written order. They had acted in accordance with German law as it existed in 1944 and 1945. Some of them had filed reports, kept records, done everything the bureaucratic system asked of them. They had created a paper trail that they believed was their legal armor. It was actually their indictment. Part 3. The Trials. The military tribunal that tried the first group of Terrorfliegererlass cases convened on the 28th of May 1945, at a location in Bavaria that 3rd Army's legal staff had requisitioned for the purpose. The proceedings were not Nuremberg. There were no theatrical speeches, no international press corps, no diplomatic gallery. This was a military court, operating under military law, run by military lawyers with military judges. The first case called was Georg Hessler, the same Georg Hessler who had walked out of a tree line and shot First Lieutenant Elmore Fabst in the back of the head. Hessler was 47 years old. He had been a minor customs official in Bavaria before joining the Gestapo in 1938. He had risen to a mid-level administrative position in the regional office. He was not a fanatic in any documentary sense. His personnel file showed no particular ideological distinction, no commendations for exceptional zeal, no record of independent initiative. He had received the order, he had carried it out, he had filed his report. His defense was exactly what Odom had anticipated. He had acted under lawful orders. He had no discretion. He was a government official executing government policy. The killing of Fabst was a lawful act under German law. Colonel Odom's prosecution team presented 3 lines of argument in response. First, the Hague Convention of 1907, Article 23, explicitly prohibited the killing of an enemy combatant who had rendered himself hors de combat, out of the fight. Fabst had landed. He was unarmed. He was not resisting. He was hors de combat by every definition the convention provided. German ratification of the Hague Convention was not in dispute. Second, the Nuremberg defense, that following orders absolved an individual of criminal responsibility, had no standing in the laws of war as they existed in 1945. This was not a post hoc invention. The position that I was following orders did not constitute a complete defense to a war crimes charge had been articulated in military legal doctrine since at least the American Civil War. Specifically in the Lieber Code of 1863, which had informed the Hague Conventions directly. Third, and this is the detail that stopped the courtroom, Odom introduced the documentation chain itself as evidence, the memos, the directives, the reporting requirements, the notification procedures that had been designed to exclude the Wehrmacht. He showed the court that the Terrorfliegererlass had been constructed specifically to make these killings happen, and specifically to prevent military officers from stopping them. This was not a soldier following battlefield orders under fire. This was a bureaucrat in a peacetime-style administrative process executing a man who had already survived the battle. The tribunal deliberated for less than 4 hours. Georg Hessler was found guilty of the murder of First Lieutenant Elmore D. Fabst. He was sentenced to death by hanging. Now here is what most accounts of this episode get wrong. The sentence was not carried out by dramatic decree or immediate execution. The military tribunal system that Odom had constructed included an appeals process, a review process, and a confirmation process that went up through Third Army's chain of command. Patton reviewed the Hessler case personally. His review is documented in Third Army records. He confirmed the sentence. But here is what Patton actually said in that review, and this is documented in the Third Army legal files that were subsequently transferred to the National Archives. He wrote that the sentence was just and correct, and that the execution should proceed without delay and without ceremony. Those 4 words, without delay and without ceremony. This is the forensic detail that tells you everything about Patton's actual position. He was not interested in making Hessler a spectacle. He was not interested in a public execution that would generate propaganda. He wanted the legal record to be correct, the sentence to be proportionate, and the thing to be done. The man who had once been accused of enjoying drama was, in this moment, entirely bureaucratic. He wanted the paperwork right and the outcome certain. Without delay and without ceremony, Hessler was hanged on the 14th of June 1945 at a military detention facility in Bavaria. The execution was witnessed by 2 military officers and a chaplain as required by procedure. There was no press, there was no announcement. The record was filed. In the weeks that followed, the tribunal worked through the remaining cases Odom had prepared. Of the 11 individuals initially charged, 9 were convicted. Of those 9, 6 received death sentences, 3 received lengthy prison terms, 2 were acquitted for insufficient evidence, cases where the documentation chain had gaps that the prosecution could not close. The 6 death sentences were all confirmed. All 6 were carried out. Part 4. The Forensic Verdict. The forensic verdict of this investigation is now clear. The Terrorfliegererlass cases tried by Third Army's military tribunal in May and June of 1945 were not, as they are sometimes characterized, an improvised act of vengeance by an impulsive general. They were a legally coherent application of existing international law, prepared by trained military lawyers, conducted under procedural safeguards, and reviewed at the command level. The legal arguments Odom made in those proceedings were not invented for the occasion. They were drawn from treaty law that predated the Second World War by nearly 4 decades. The speed was real. The proceedings moved fast by any standard. The first case was tried less than 3 weeks after the German surrender. But speed is not the same as arbitrariness. Odom's team had been building these cases since January. The evidence was assembled. The legal theory was prepared. When Patton gave the order to proceed, the apparatus was ready. Now address the myth directly. The myth is that Patton's involvement in these trials was an expression of his personal temperament, his aggression, his impatience, his tendency toward confrontation. The documentation does not support this reading. His contribution to the Terror Fliegererlass prosecutions was not emotional. It was institutional. He provided the authority to proceed, he confirmed the sentences, and he did so with the phrase, "without delay and without ceremony," which is the language of a man who wants the legal record to be clean, not the language of a man who wants to make a point. The more complicated question is what these trials accomplished and what they did not. They accomplished the prosecution of 9 individuals who had committed documented killings of Allied airmen. They established within the Third Army's operational jurisdiction that the Terror Fliegererlass was not a legal defense and that its perpetrators were criminally liable under international law. They created a body of precedent, modest in scale but real, that fed into the broader war crimes proceedings that followed. What they did not accomplish was the prosecution of the policy's architects. Kaltenbrunner was tried at Nuremberg and hanged in October of 1946. But Heinrich Müller, the man who built the administrative machinery, who drafted the notification procedures, who specifically excluded the Wehrmacht from the chain of oversight, was never found. He was never tried. He was never hanged. He disappeared in the final days of the Battle of Berlin, and despite decades of investigation by multiple intelligence services, no confirmed account of his fate has ever been established. Hold that fact. The man who designed the system that killed 350 airmen was never held accountable. The men who used the system were prosecuted. The architect walked away, or died in the rubble, or escaped to South America, or was recruited by a post-war intelligence service. No one knows. The files are still open. The men who were executed by Third Army's tribunal were not the policy's architects. They were its instruments. This does not make their prosecution wrong. The Hague Convention did not distinguish between the man who wrote the order and the man who pulled the trigger. Both were liable. But the asymmetry is real, and it matters. Now return to the men who died under the policy. The 350 figure, and it may have been higher, Allied investigators acknowledged they could not document every case, represents something specific. These were not combat deaths. They were not accidents. They were not the fog of war producing tragic outcomes. They were men who had survived the most dangerous part of their mission, who had exited their destroyed aircraft, who had descended safely, and who were then killed by people who had paperwork authorizing the killing. First Lieutenant Elmore D. Fapst was from Macon, Georgia. He had flown 23 missions. He had survived flak that tore his aircraft apart at 9,000 feet. He had bailed out. He had landed. He was alive. And then George Hessler walked out of the tree line. The trial that followed, the sentence that followed, the execution that followed, these were not revenge. They were the application of a legal framework that existed precisely to make this kind of killing criminal. The framework had existed since 1907. It had been ratified by Germany. It had been ignored by Germany. And when the war ended, Third Army's legal apparatus applied it. What does Patton's role in this actually tell us about him? The honest answer tells us something that his popular image, the pearl-handled revolvers, the slapping incident, the speeches about blood and guts, tends to obscure. He understood institutional authority. He understood that military law required military enforcement. When Colonel Odom brought him 11 documented cases of murder committed under the color of official policy, Patton did not organize a firing squad. He convened a tribunal. He let lawyers make the arguments. He reviewed the record. He confirmed the sentences through the proper chain. He wrote without delay and without ceremony. That phrase has stayed in the Third Army legal files for 80 years. It is not a famous quote. It is not in any Patton biographies that focus on the battlefield. It is in an administrative record in the National Archives, on a confirmation memo for a death sentence. Without delay and without ceremony. That is what justice looked like in Bavaria in June of 1945. Not triumphant, not theatrical, not the version of Patton that Hollywood made. A general, a stack of files, a legal review, and a sentence confirmed in 4 words. Elmore Fabst was buried at the Lorraine American Cemetery in Saint-Avold, France. He was 24 years old. He is in Plot C, row 12. Georg Hessler is buried in an unmarked grave at the detention facility where he was executed. His name does not appear in any memorial. The system that killed Fabst was built by a man who was never found, and somewhere in the German countryside, in a field that no longer looks like a field, a parachute dragged slowly in the wind. If this investigation gave you something the standard histories don't, not the version that survived into the textbooks, but the version that lives in legal files and confirmation memos and cemetery records, press like. It keeps this kind of work visible a little longer, and that matters.